okay. Not at all.
Is that working okay?
That's great,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's a beaver swimming across our screen, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for asking me to speak. I'll do a bit of a whistle-stop tour and happy to take any questions after. So yeah, without further ado, I will start. Well, I'll try to start. There we go. So I think it's generally accepted that people will say the wetlands are the kidneys of our landscapes. And hopefully by the end of this brief talk, I'll convince you that, well, beavers are actually the restorers of wetland. Now, before I go any further, there's a big caveat to this talk, especially with a Northern Irish audience, that beavers, unfortunately, we've no evidence have ever existed in Ireland. So whilst I tell you how brilliant beavers are and how everyone needs them for their wetlands, I'm afraid there's a bit of a caveat for Ireland, but we can come back to that. So basically, I will start off with, where did our wetlands go? I would say wetlands are one of our most important habitats. And I mean, there's a rough statistics, but we think wetlands, sorry? Okay. We think wetlands take about less than 1% of the Earth's surface, but over 12% of all biodiversity lives in wetlands, so they're vitally important. Now we know humans have drained and used wetlands for many, many centuries, going back thousands of years. But in the last 100 years, there's been a disproportionate loss in wetlands, and that's really as we industrialize and have developed. And if we look even just to Europe, it's estimated that at least over actually 90% of all our rivers have been highly modified. So what we see today as our rivers, they're not natural functioning systems a lot of the time, and many are disconnected from their floodplains. And this is really quite crucial to wetland restoration and ecology. Now, when it comes to beavers, well, our beavers almost completely disappeared. Beavers are native to the Northern Hemisphere, so there's two species. There's the North American beaver, which obviously goes from Canada right down to nearly Florida. And there's the Eurasian beaver, which pretty much spreads from Britain right across to China and Mongolia. So these maps are just for the Eurasian beaver. But just to try and get into people's mindset, this was once such a common species. So marked in red there on the left, beavers occupy pretty much every freshwater habitat right across Europe. There's obviously an empty space in Ireland there and some of the southern European countries, but this was such a widespread species and there's millions and millions of them. Now, what happened? Well, the fur trade happened, and basically we almost successfully got rid of both species purely through hunting for fur. So the map on the right is where beavers, the Eurasian beaver was reduced down to in Europe. So it was estimated at one time only about 1,000 individuals remained, and basically because they were persecuted. So when we talk about beaver restoration, now it's actually a big conservation success story, and this is a species we have brought back from the brink purely through conservation efforts and reintroductions. Now, I obviously don't need to tell this group, we are in an era of extinctions, and this is what's known as the 6th extinction era. Now, what's different about this one is it's rapidly accelerating, and we can point a lot of these extinctions due to human modifications. Now, there's many causes of extinctions, there's many solutions. So I'm just going to pull out one part as reintroduction as a species restoration tool, because this is hopefully what I try to do day to day. So ultimately, unless we remove the causes of extinctions, they're going to keep on happening. So I just want to kind of introduce this concept that reintroduction can be a valuable conservation tool. Now, reintroductions in themselves can be controversial. Some people believe we shouldn't be interfering. We should maybe just protect habitat, see what comes back. But I kind of want to propose, well, without reintroduction efforts, there's some species in the wild today that wouldn't have existed without this kind of interference or positive action, whatever you want to call it. Now, of course, not all reintroductions are successful. They can be expensive. Many still fail over the long term. So it's a long-term commitment to reintroduce species, and ultimately we have to prepare to see animals back again. And what we can see time and time again is it really depends what species you're trying to bring back and how accepted it is. So sometimes I'm afraid if you're a boring plant, shall we say, or a small boring insect, people mostly don't really care or pay attention. So these projects can happen quite relatively fast and unnoticed. When it comes to some of the larger mammals, then reintroductions are very controversial. And I'll put beavers into that category, and I'll go on to discuss why. So ultimately, well, why are we even talking about beavers? And again, I apologise for a more Irish audience, but in Britain, the land mass, there's been lots and lots of history with beavers and people living alongside beavers. We've got evidence that they existed in and around here, you know, from 2 million years up to about 400 years ago. So it was estimated about 400 years ago, we successfully removed them from the entire length of Britain. And again, that was mainly through persecution. So why bring beavers back? Well, people are you know, very, people believe it's a native species and it should be here. So there's a big ethical debate, obviously, as you know, going on at the minute about restoring our lost species. Now, still, even though beavers can be controversial, there's a huge public desire to see this species back. Now, of course, it helps when you're kind of a cute, furry mammal and very charismatic, but, you know, still, beavers capture the hearts and mind of people. Yes, they can be controversial, especially in some land sector use, but the majority of people that we ask, and we've done many national surveys, really want to see this species back. The big part of beaver restoration, especially, you know, for myself, I believe this is such a vital species, especially when it comes to wetland restoration, that the habitat they create and the biodiversity they generate, it's what we call a keystone species. So it's significantly more, more impact on habitats and species biodiversity than some other animals. So beavers really are the linchpin, I think, that keep our wetland systems functioning where they are native. And with this comes a whole lot of ecological services. And, you know, beavers can do so much good in the right place, and I am putting that in kind of quotations, because in the wrong place, obviously beavers can cause conflict. But if we let beavers carry out their normal activities, such as damming, for example, or introducing kind of diversity into the forest system, they can really do a lot of good, such as holding back sediment. We all know soil is running off our lands and being flushed down our kind of water courses. So beavers hold back soil, they hold back sediment. They also can drastically improve water quality. And where we see water traveling through a series of beaver dams, and I've got a slide later on, you can see they really do improve the quality, and this has been tested time and time again. So these are all important services that we are paying as taxpayers as well. And, you know, as a collective system, you know, we are looking to how we manage as humans the landscapes. And I think everyone's starting to ask questions about how we have farmed and managed our landscapes to date. So what we are trying to say to people is beavers are an interesting component in this that can do a lot of good as well if we tolerate them. As an aside, there was an EU legislation when I guess we were part of that, that all member states had to at least investigate the feasibility of beavers coming back as one of several species. Now that didn't mean they had to reintroduce them, but Scotland took that responsibility seriously and was investigating you know, the concept of beaver feasibility, you know, 15, 20 years ago. So this is a nice slide that I've pinched from some of our, I think, Dutch colleagues. And it just, I think, nicely captures, in essence, what beavers can do if you let them carry out their normal activities. Really, a whole food web and functioning can exist in one beaver pond. So when beavers dam, they obviously hold water on the landscapes. Beaver foraging will create dead and standing wood, which we all know is vitally important to our ecosystems. So many other animals come and either live in the pond or in the complex shoreline that beavers develop. So if you go to a beaver pond, especially a mature one, the amount of life you see is really quite impressive, from increased numbers of a range of bats, to insects, to fish, and all, obviously all different birds coming in and filling different trophic levels. And again, larger mammals are coming to beaver ponds. In Scotland already, we see otters fishing, we see pine martens coming down and foraging. There's a whole host of life around a beaver pond that can be really quite dramatic. And this is a beaver pond in reality. So sometimes it depends who my audience is, but when I show this slide to kind of land managers, you can see a look of horror on their face. But what I try to say to them is, if we give beavers space, you can automatically see where a pair of beavers have moved in here, and after a few years, they've drastically changed this very flat agricultural area. And they do this in all sorts of different ways. So it's about, introducing diversity in the woodland. It's about selective foraging, changing the plant species composition, but also the plant structure. It's about putting dams in, re-meandering the water course, just changing all the different kind of habitats. So what was once kind of grass or cropland, you've got a range of kind of marshes, you've got grassland, meadows, and you've got woodland diversity. So beavers can do really exciting changes in a very short space of time, but that is if we can tolerate them. And with this comes a whole host of these ecological services that I mentioned. So these are just some pictures from one of the Welsh projects, just a range of invertebrate life, all taken around a beaver pond. And obviously there's lots of different interesting bird species that are coming down to feed on these insects. And in turn, the reptile amphibian life is just thriving in these areas. So I'm going to show you this video. So ignore the mallards, but see if you look in the right, in the background, you see a beaver swimming. Hopefully you can see that. And there's a little grebe just following the beaver. And this is obviously an ancient relationship, where beavers used to be in our wetlands, and the grebe following it, eating on the invertebrate life that the beaver's staring up behind. So just wanted to kind of introduce the complexities and relationships that are going on. So this was a lovely piece of footage, just caught on a CCTV camera, so it's quite sweet. And here I think, I love this photo. This is from the Devon Beaver Trial. And in this, it was a pair of beavers that were introduced to an enclosure, a quite spacious enclosure, but in 2011, a pair of beavers were released. So if you look on the left, what you see, the black line is the original water course. And this was just like a trickle of a stream that beavers were released into, kind of wet woodland. And above and below, well, the whole site actually is surrounded by heavily grazed agriculture. So you can see 2012, the vertical lines, the black lines, they're the dams that the beaver put in. And you can see over the years, beavers have added, so I think it's up to 13 dams. They added in quite quick succession. So the water is traveling through, running off agricultural land, traveling through all these dams. So the picture on the right, we see the first tub of water is how the water looks when it enters the system. And I think what's quite exciting, the picture or the tub on the right, is how water leaves the system. And it's just to kind of emphasize the amount of sediment, and with that nitrates, fertilizer, that's all trapped behind all these dams. So beavers are really improving the water quality. But of course, if we want to see these benefits, we have to kind of tolerate beaver activities. And I think this is the key point, really. So there might be an ecological tolerance of beavers, but I think there's also a cultural tolerance of beavers, and those don't always match up. So I show this picture and I kind of ask people, well, where do you think beavers want to live? And, sometimes, people would point to the left, and of course beavers want to live there. That's luxury beaver habitat. That's absolutely lovely. But beavers equally will live and be very happy and very productive and breed very nicely in the kind of habitats on the right. And this is what a lot of our farmland looks like, especially farmland on a floodplain. So you've got a whole series of drainage ditches. So from a beaver point of view, that's brilliant. They've got water. It's very manageable water because they could easily put a dam in there. It'll take a few nights of hard effort and a dam will go in. The banks are very deep, you know, they're quite, they can dig into them, they can make burrows in there, so they've got shelter, and they've got a whole host of food on tap. So even if there's not a lot of trees about, beavers will still live because they'll eat such a wide range of vegetation, they can do quite happily. And of course, this leads to conflicts. So these are all pictures from sites I've worked at in Scotland. So beaver burrowing is a big issue. Burrows can appear. They're a big, strong animal, so they can create quite big shelters quite fast. Damming, of course, they're famous for their damming activities. So we've had cases where water is spilling into fields and putting areas out of production. We've got dams kind of slipping down and blocking culverts or roads. So that's another challenge in the system. And of course, beaver feeding is quite dramatic and, you know, iconic beaver feeding on trees. Now, of course, if it's trees no one really worries about, and it's our native species like willow, these are species that have evolved with beavers, so they can cope with beaver feeding, and they'll coppice nicely, and they can have their roots wetter than normal if beavers dam. But other species, such as this field of broccoli, for example, or if it's a non-native tree species, or often, you know, I've been called in if someone's prized apple tree or cherry tree, which is all good beaver foods, you know, that can really upset people. And we have to work, you know, alongside these people to say, okay, what can we do to help as well, so that we encourage people to live alongside beavers again, because people can see this as quite dramatic. And yeah, I mean, it's upsetting if mature trees are felled as well. So we've developed, and we look at our colleagues in North America and Europe. So there's a whole host of beaver mitigation methods. So anything from protecting trees with tree guards, which, you know, I remind people, this is a standard we do for deer and rabbit in the country. So now we're starting to say to people, well, if you've got lots of high value trees by a watercourse in parts of Scotland, we're going to have to protect them first, because beavers are expanding quite nicely through our catchments. We've got things like exclusion fencing, or so other times we've got what we call flow devices. So we pipe the water through beaver dams so that beavers can coexist, and they have a bit of a pond, but we can set the level of tolerance of how much water is impounded behind those dams. But also, I think it's about change and our tolerance for change as the human race. And, you know, when beavers first move into an area, there's no doubt about it, it can look very dramatic, and people get kind of upset because, you know, a lot of trees come down and they see that as wasteful. And what we're trying to say to people, well, I think we have to change our mentality a bit, because this is a species we haven't lived together with for hundreds of years. So of course, when we put change in the system, it can be quite, you know, upsetting, and people don't like change. But what I say is, well, we are still at the beginning of the beaver restoration process. These landscapes have not matured yet. And if these are all native tree species, they start to regenerate. So what you actually have is a very different type of riparian zone, which is more naturalistic in what it should look like. So on the right here is a picture. This is downtown Munich, where obviously beavers have lived for several years. So if you can see the trees in the background, you know, big mature trees, obviously quite, you know, dramatic in the city. Lots of people walk here, they see those trees. Beavers moved in, they chopped down the mature trees. You know, obviously there was a point people were upset about that. But in the foreground, just immediately lining the bank, are those trees that have coppiced and they've bushed up, and what you see is this diversity in woodland. And again, that goes back to why beavers are quite an exciting species, because they introduce this dynamic change. And when you have this kind of landscape, more species kind of live in those and can utilize those areas. So it is a bit of perception and time, and, you know, beavers can change these riparian zones quite dramatically, but quite beneficially. But we have to kind of see the outcome at the end, and not just a load of dead trees at the start. And I think this comes down to, you know, as society, we probably have a choice. How do we want our landscapes to look? So if our farmland, for example, looks like this is still good beaver habitat, and beavers will occupy this, but beavers will immediately have I guess, a quite negative impact on these areas. They will, fell the trees, they could have more conflicts with the agricultural landowner. But again, we have to question, should we be farming to the water's edge? Is that good for us as society? Is it good for our wetland conservation? Immediately you can think of all the soil runoff into that system, all the nitrates and fertilizers running straight into these environments. And what we've seen, where humans are immediately using the water edge vicinity, that's where all the vast majority of beaver conflicts happen. So it's this buffer zone within 10 to 20 meters of freshwater habitat. So ultimately, the biggest, challenge and request is, let's give our rivers and waterways space. Now, that's not just for beavers. It will reduce a lot of the beaver conflict, but it's also probably what we should be doing as, a greater good for society to, conserve our soil, to stop polluting rivers, and from that beavers will benefit and kind of live in those areas too, and then we'll have all the benefits of beavers as well. So there's a few photos here from Bavaria. Now what you have is still a quite heavily agricultural farmed landscape, but if you look in the valley in the bottom, beavers have been given space, and both these examples, actually it's the Bavarian state government has bought that stretch of land off the landowner, and beavers are allowed to be there, and they're allowed to develop these brilliant wetland systems. So we're getting the benefits of beaver activity, but it's not about putting lots of land out of use at all. So this is hopefully the vision in Britain going forward, but you can imagine the politics of suggesting this right now. So just to sum up, and I'll end with a few hopefully nice videos of beavers. I'll stop talking at you. So we say the beavers' return to Britain has been fairly mixed. It's been a mix of official releases, it's been a mix of unofficial releases, and people have got frustrated at the slowness of the system. I think people want to be doing stuff. There's definitely a call for action, and rewilding is a big concept at the minute. But I think we can't forget beavers are significant modifiers of our ecosystems. Next to humans and maybe elephants, beavers can drastically change whole landscapes if we let them. So that could be, it has to be compatible with modern living as well. But from this, we can see a whole host of benefits, and it'll go back to these ecological services. The official reintroduction process, it's been long and tedious, but we've learned, valuable lessons, and now this is starting to roll out, especially in England. There's a big call, and I currently spend a lot of my life moving beavers from conflict zones in Scotland down to projects in England. There's still a lot of public support for beavers, and people love them, people want to see them back, people believe it's the right thing. But we can't underestimate there are conflicts with beavers, and we need to work together and have a proper functioning management system that is funded, because ultimately things come down to resources. Quite excitingly, beavers were made a European protected species in Scotland in 2019, and that was after over 10-15 years of us kind of working together with people on their restoration. But at the same time, lethal control is now permitted as well, so that in itself has been quite controversial. But I guess my main take-home message is just a cry for, let's have these animals back in our landscapes, because this idea of slowing water flow, trapping sediment, and just renaturalizing our riparian zones, I think is really crucial for society going forward as well. So I'll just play these wee videos. This is a pair have moved from a conflict zone, so hopefully this works. So just to kind of say, they're really big, really beautiful animals, and quite fun to work with. And these ones are destined for restoration projects in England. Yeah, it's going to go slow. They do move faster than that, believe me. And I'll just finish on this. This is one. It's going off on its merry way into Scottish habitat, this was. I'll just finish there. So thanks very much for listening, and yeah, if anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Does that work?
Roisin, thank you very, very much. That was brilliant.
Cool.
Really, really brilliant.
Great. Yeah.
And we have a few